Good evening, and thank you very much for your time. Willie Madisha, I'll begin with you with the backdrop of what we are hearing the unions say is going on in those negotiations. But we also know this has been the position a government has been presenting, even in their court battle, that there is currently a bad state of the country's economy. There is very, very little income coming in, yet we are still continuing to spend a lot because of our expenditure needs, and they've even had to divert resources from some parts of much-needed services in order to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you feel the decision to review the 2018 agreement undermines the collective bargaining in that context?
Thank you. Thank you very much, and all the listeners or the viewers. What the South African government has done, and of course continues to do, to the public service workers is extremely unfortunate. A 3-year agreement was signed between the unions and government after a very lengthy negotiations period, with workers compromising their very many proposals, including better salary demands. We know that the 3-year agreement had to be implemented by both parties, namely the workers and the government as the employer. And further that, none of the parties was supposed to move out of the agreement until the end of the 3rd year, when new negotiations would be gone into and a new agreement arrived at. But what did the government do? It simply, number one, ignored the workers. It stopped the annual salary increments. It pushed out many workers from the posts they previously occupied. It stopped implementing the agreement they reached with unions. And government again is now summoning unions to engage in new negotiations. Now, forget what was agreed to 3 years ago. They're simply saying nothing. That's nothing altogether. They're going on. Now, this is extremely important. Government cares less about the workers. Now, as a former president of workers myself, I can attest without any doubt the frustrations and sufferings that all those poor workers are going through, what they are faced with.
Yeah.
All that I want to say is this government has failed the workers, and therefore the question that we need to ask now is what must be done.
Yeah.
And one has a number of proposals, which one believes has got to be looked
We'll get into that. A fair review of the affordability of this agreement, do you think that it is a fair thing to do, right? Considering the fact that when they were making their realistic calculations in 2018, no one could have foreseen that in 2020 there will be a pandemic. Now, part of the requirements in terms of reaching these agreements from the regulations is that a realistic calculation of the costs involved in both the current and subsequent fiscal years has got to be taken into consideration. This would not have been possible because all the variables would not have been available to them.
If you have checked what government has been doing or has done to date, it has used this thing of COVID to basically move away from what it was supposed to do. All that which it was supposed to deliver to the people of our country, it has simply moved out and said, or continued to say, we are faced with a problem of COVID, etc. But then this very government consists of people, of men and women, and you as people in the media fraternity know, of men and women who continue to steal from government. When you talk about stealing, you talk about corruption, it is the very same people who are supposed to give the workers what the workers are supposed to get, who are continuing to steal from the people of South Africa. And again, one is prepared to give very many examples of that which this government is and is continuing to do really to the poor working class, to the poor people of our country. And a lot has got to be done. Government has failed and continues to fail.
Now, on that very same issue, I know I've spoken to the unions. They continue to raise that issue that workers can no longer be the ones who are taking the fall for government's corrupt ways and irregular expenditure and so on and so forth, downright theft that we have been seeing. But the question that the minister is raising is saying, well, government recognizes this trust deficit with labor, and what they are doing right now is they are trying to quail corruption with all these institutions and processes that they've put in place. Is that enough?
No. Look at what government is doing. How much are they borrowing from the World Bank, from the IMF on a daily basis? You talk about R1 billion, almost daily, okay? Now, what is going to happen at the end? I'm saying that they've stolen a lot of money. They continue to steal a lot of money, and the people of South Africa are aware. And government continues to take loans on a daily basis. And at the end, the amounts that we've got to pay as a country, what we owe the World Bank, what we owe the IMF, we won't be able to pay. Children, our children, great-grandchildren that shall come after us 50, 60 years from today are still going to be suffering because of the failure by this particular government, the looting, and all this kind of wrong things, improper planning, thievery by this government, which is doing that which it agrees to with the workers of our country, and the very many people that will be born after ourselves are going to suffer. We won't be able to pay back the international community.
Yeah. Should government concede to the salary hike? Look at that outcome, and if that outcome leads to the undermining of the country's finances, would that be a decision in public interest? Dr. Madisha?
Hello. Look, what I'm saying is that there are very many, there's what has got to be done. For example, what I'm saying is that government must keep to the agreements. 2, government must reduce the topmost staff that earns millions per annum. Look at what the DGs, the DDGs, the chief directors are getting. They're getting millions. They're getting hundreds of thousands per month. They're getting cars and many other benefits. Whereas ordinary workers at the lowest level are getting, 20,000 per month, etc., which is not a living wage. What it must do, government again, it must reduce this many departments by making some of them. What we must do again, government must look at the crowd of ministers and deputy ministers. I've raised this in a parliament. Look at our population. It's very small. It's plus minus 60 million. And you compare this to the USA with 350 million people. You compare this with China with 1.3 billion people. But then in South Africa, you have, a crowd. You take the ministers, you take the deputy ministers, put them together, give them lots and lots of money. You're talking about 70 people, okay? Now, when you go to America, you go to China, they talk about 18 people with all those millions. But then South African government is going on exploiting the people of South Africa,
right.
Money that must pay the workers, money that must improve the lives of people. But then this is taken to those particular few people, which is further stolen on a daily basis. But
right.
Again, I must end by saying what government must do is to implement agreements.
Right.
Otherwise, negotiations are useless.
Let's come back to that thought. Let's come back to that thought in a moment. Should government reconsider its salary freeze position? Leon, speaking on behalf of the Democratic Alliance, is up next. Stay with us. Come back to the newsfeed late night. Public sector wage negotiations coming to a deadlock this past Friday. This as public servants demand a 7% hike in salaries, while government is standing firm on its 0%. Freezing all salaries, this is to try and at least cut the salary bill by 160 billion rands, at least in the next 3 years. We have the DA Shadow Minister for Public Service and Administration, Schreiber, councillor with us, as well as COPE MP, Willie Madisha. You're part of the conversation tonight on Twitter at Newsroom405, or you WhatsApp your questions and your comments on 072-110-5584. Leon, I'll start with you then. Same question, looking at the bad state of the economy, no income currently because of COVID-19, yet we continue to spend on things like the social grants, which are particularly important. We are spending on TERS right now for those who've lost their job, 1.3 million or so during this pandemic. We are continuing to divert the necessary resources to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you feel the decision by government to review the 2018 agreement is undermining collective bargaining in the country?
Good evening, Talbot, and good evening to the viewers. Well, I think what really undermined collective bargaining originally was the 2018 agreement itself, which, as you know, the Labour Appeals Court has struck down as illegal because it was not properly entered into from the government side. And that really set the scene for what we're seeing now, because that 2018 agreement came on the back of a decade where public servant salaries already increased by more than 60%. In the period of 10 years. This is after being adjusted for inflation. And then the 2018 agreement granted very significant increases on top of that. So what you have then is the public service wage increases being a huge component of the reason why South Africa finds itself really on the verge of a debt crisis. Now, you've mentioned the COVID pandemic and the fact that that really put a significant strain on the economy. But the COVID pandemic really came at the worst possible time for the South African economy. And one of the reasons it was such a bad time is because the state had, for more than a decade, increased public servants' wage bill at a rate that was entirely unaffordable. It's something that the DA was warning about throughout the 2010s. And what we see now is, with this crisis having struck, our country is on the road to a debt ratio of where our debt will be more than 100% of our GDP. And I think it's also important to point out here that South Africa does not only consist of the 1.3 million public servants, it consists of the 60 million people who work here, the vast majority of which who live here, who work in the private sector. And just last year, 52 cents out of every R1 paid in taxes went to pay salaries of public servants. Now, clearly, that is an unsustainable situation. And if you compare the reality of public servants going through this pandemic, the reality is that public servants continue to receive full pay. They continue to receive full benefits in this crisis, while 2 million people in the private sector lost their jobs and millions more became dependent on TERS funding.
That's the argument. That's the argument from government, Leon. They're saying, well, you guys... people in the private sector lost their jobs, you got job security, so the best we can do is freeze. Yet, though, they paid in 2018, they paid in 2019, and would it be not realistic to say, well, you've already paid the 2 years, continue to pay and make good on the agreement, whether it was entered into illegally or not? It's something that you're picking up post the fact that we reached an agreement. And the unions are telling us that, in fact, they did not want a 3-year settlement. They would have preferred a 1-year settlement. It is government itself that came with the offer of a 3-year settlement.
I think it's highly hypocritical, and you're right to point it out, Tabo, that you pay an agreement for 2 years, and then in the 3rd year you suddenly discover that it's unaffordable. But that doesn't mean it was the right agreement for the country. So, yes, they woke up too late, and I think they have seriously damaged their own credibility, the state, in that process. But the reality is that those 2018 wage increases were already unaffordable, and it would have been far preferable for us to have a more sustainable agreement in 2018, which would have meant that we didn't go into this crisis in such bad shape. So I certainly understand the credibility knock that they've taken. But the other point I want us to focus on, Tava, is the fact that, as Mr. Madisha said, I think that there's a way here for us to solve this conundrum without punishing our police officers, our teachers, our nurses for these mistakes. Already back in October 2019, the DA introduced a proposal which we sent to Minister Senzo Mkhunu, which showed that if we actually reduce the number of people who earn more than R1 million a year, so there are 29,000 public servants earning more than R1 million a year. These are director generals, deputy director generals, people who sit mostly in offices all day, administrators, if we reduce that number by a third, we would actually save so much money that we can still grant at least inflation-linked increases for our police officers, teachers, and nurses, etc. And I think that's something that really urgently needs to be explored as we find a solution going forward.
So public sector needs drastic changes, Leon, so says the Minister of Public Service and Administration. The options that are on the table, it seems, cut heads, that is the head count, freeze salaries, or cut on benefits to reach that 160 billion in the next 3 years. Are those really the only options, or is there more that government can do?
Well, I think the priority should be, and anyone who has a progressive outlook on this would say that we must protect the most vulnerable and the people who deliver the frontline service to our people. Those are the people who must be protected as much as possible from these changes. So that's why I'm saying that you really need to focus the cuts at the top, where you're able to make the biggest savings without necessarily impacting the frontline service delivery workers the most. Because we must remember that the people who come when a crime has been committed is not someone who sits in an air-conditioned office all day in Pretoria. It's your local police officer. The teacher who teaches your child is not some cadre that's deployed to the education department at head office. It is a teacher in your local community. Those are the people we must aim to protect as much as possible from the cuts, and make sure that many of the people who are appointed to the senior positions are also people appointed on the basis of political considerations, their political loyalty to the ANC. Those are the people where the changes and the reductions have to be made. However, if we're going to talk about the fundamental change our public service needs, we also have to talk about the people who we're actually employing in these positions. Because at the end of the day, these are not just numbers. These are people who should be delivering services to the 60 million South Africans. And that's why it's so critical that we stop the process of appointing connected cadres to these positions, make sure that we end cadre deployment, and to that effect, the DA has already introduced a bill in Parliament, which we hope Minister Mkhunu will support if he's serious about the kind of fundamental change our public service needs to become professional and sustainable.
The department, or even government at large, saying we are trying to address this question of a trust deficit. You call it a credibility issue earlier on between government and Labour by quelling corruption. Are they doing enough? You think are they proving to the public servants enough that this is what they're doing? And are they being believable? I mean, considering that even during a time as serious as a pandemic, money was still being stolen.
Yes, I think that is a critical point. And with that, I do agree with Mr. Madisha. I think the levels of corruption we've seen, not only through the Zuma years, but very recently, is something that further undermines the trust not only of public servants, but of the South African public more broadly in the state and in the government. So I think that it's not a question of either or, where we say either we cut the wage bill or we end corruption. I think it's something where we really need to focus on both. And I would add to that saying that the credibility of the state is so weakened because of these kinds of corruption allegations and scandals that we've seen recently, that it now almost becomes impossible for them to actually make collective bargaining itself work going forward. However, it is critical that that they keep the line on these wage reductions, because the reality is, Thabo, if we do not rein in public sector spending, and that doesn't only include salaries, it includes things like SAA bailouts, the continuous bailouts to Eskom, the bloated size of the South African state and all the sectors in which it's involved. If we don't urgently move to a situation where we empower the private sector and ordinary people to play a bigger role in our economy, then we're going to reach that stage of a debt crisis, and then we won't be talking about wage increases for anyone. We'll be talking about massive wage reductions, explosions in poverty, and potentially an inflation crisis. That's what's at stake ultimately at the end of the day.
Let me understand what you're saying. You're saying privatization would be a way to rein in public sector spend?
Absolutely it would. I mean, just look at SAA as one example. We all know, I think, at this point that the 10 billion rand that was allocated to Eskom, to SAA last year could have been much better spent in various fields, potentially even in protecting our teachers and nurses and police officers from wage reductions. So if you are able to move that burden away from the state, get it off the books of the state. You empower the private sector to actually take over that sector, for example. You're able to actually reduce wages very dramatically, and at the end of the day, you will actually improve the sustainability of the state itself. That's why the irony is, when you talk about privatization and making more room for the market to play its role, it's not only something that's beneficial to the private sector, it actually also helps the state, because it allows the state to focus its scarce resources on things like education, right, social grants, and other things like that.
Willie Madisha, former president of the Workers, I want you to respond to that when we come back from the break. Privatization, getting more private sector involvement will lift the burden from the state and rein in issues that have got to do with public sector spend. The DA Shadow Minister of Public Service and Administration, Schreiber, as well as COPE MP Willie Madisha, continuing with us next. And you're part of this. We'll take your questions at Newsroom 405. WhatsApp your questions and your comments to 072. Speed Late Night continues for you now here on Newsroom Africa Channel 405. With me tonight, the DA Shadow Minister for Public Service and Administration, Schreiber, as well as COPE Member of Parliament, Willie Madisha, as well as your comments tonight on Twitter at Newsroom 405. WhatsApp your questions and your comments to 072 110 5584. Before we went into break, the DA Shadow Minister raising the question of reining in public sector spend through privatization and lifting the burden from the state. As a former representative of the workers, Dr. Madisha, what is your feeling on that proposal?
When it comes to this one of privatization for us, that has been a problem. Look, what we are looking at is that, look at the unemployment rate, for example. You speak of more than 40%. And if you look at the young people, you are looking at more than 56%. People are not employed. You look at the levels of poverty, extremely high. You look at the incapacity by the government, present government. You are faced with horrendous challenges. Now, if we were to say that people who are poor, who are unemployed, must simply go through these areas of privatization, we want to argue from the side of COPE that we will be faced with momentous challenges. Now, the government of ANC is not dealing with these areas that I've raised. Instead, what they are doing, they are inter alia concentrating on some of the commissions. But then these commissions, for example, I'll give you the Zondo one. It is supposed to look at the problems which, engulf the country. But what the ANC, for example, is doing, it has turned that particular commission into something that looks into the problems of that particular organization, to say who is against who must be the leader, who must not be the leader, who stole, and so on. Now, these are some of the problems that I spoke about corruption. But then I wish to believe that all the people of our country, including my colleagues in the DA, will understand that the unemployment rate, the poverty rate, the incapacity by government, the fact that our people are lying in the street and so on, that really want assist us if we were to say, let's simply have privatization. Now, further, let us look at the people who are working in our restaurants.
Yeah, before we go to that, talk to me about the question then, still in the public service, of having people who are unqualified working in top jobs. Qualifications for senior government officials, 35% of senior government officials not qualified for their job. Should they continue to be working there?
That's exactly what COPE has said, that we must look at the audits so that very many people who are young, for example, who are qualified, who are running around the streets, who have, BCom degrees and a whole lot of other degrees, who are not having employment, are actually replaced by those people who don't have qualifications altogether. And those people who don't have qualifications, who are they? They are relatives, they are children, wives, and husbands of those who are already in power. Now, we need to have a proper audit, person power audit, check if the people who are there can be able to deliver to the people of our country. Now, the workers in our country, both organized and unorganized, have raised this Badula problem to say that we are sidelined basically because those who hold power give positions to their own relatives. Now, we need to look into that. Therefore, the issue of unemployment, of poverty, that has got to be looked into by ourselves as political parties and really understand and embrace the momentous challenges that are raised, that are faced by the people of our country.
Have we passed the point, Leon, of active engagement to reach an amicable decision? I mean, look at the deadlock that we're dealing with on Friday already. Yet the minister comes out and says, we don't want a situation where it's us and them. We must move past the point where it's Labour coming with demands and government meeting demands. Let's have an active engagement where we talk about these things ahead of time and reach some kind of an amicable outcome. I mean, are we far past that?
You know what is going to happen? We are going to an election, all right? What this government always does, this ruling party always does, is to go into, negotiations and smile, at the unions or with the unions and reach particular agreements. And immediately after the elections, those agreements will not be implemented. But then instead, government will move away and shun the workers, downgrade those particular agreements. And those are the kind of problems that we're faced with. And it is high time the people of South Africa stood up and realized where the problems are. The problems are not with the other ordinary people. The problems are with this government that is leading them. Lie, 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 get votes, and after that, forget the people. I mean, you are the best witness. Whomever is listening, whomever is watching, is the best witness of what is happening in our country. And it is high time that the people stood up and dealt with this problem, that we then can be able to rise as South Africans and address this.
Right.
Otherwise, we shall go back to Zimbabwe. We shall go back to all these African countries where people will cry, cry, cry. And when you go to elections, others say, we are the liberation movement. And then after, smiling, thereafter, they shun you. Let us not allow that. We shan't go anywhere altogether.
Let's take some WhatsApp messages then from Gifts. Gift says if they don't pay us or if they don't want to pay us, it's fine. We'll stop our services to the country. Leon, public sector wage bill deadlocked on Friday. Can South Africa afford a strike?
No, I don't think we can. And just to your earlier question, I think the point about the credibility of the government having taken such a big knock is really now coming back to haunt them, and that's what we're seeing playing out in these negotiations. But the reality is that South Africa is already down, and I don't think it's fair to kick South Africa while it's down by engaging in threats like these and in strike action. It's of course the rights of the unions to exercise these, and we will protect and support those rights. But I think if you look at the context in South Africa where so many people outside of the public service have been dumped into massive suffering, I don't think it's something where we should be kicking our country while it's already down. I think that the point made right at the beginning of this segment about the need for sacrifices includes all of us, including public sector workers. I think people in the private sector have sacrificed massively throughout this pandemic, many of them giving up their incomes or parts of their incomes, and I think it's only fair that that is extended across society. I would like to say, though, on the point regarding privatization, I would go back and say it has a critical role if we are going to find a way to stabilize South Africa's public finances. The problems that Mr. Madisha describes, unemployment, poverty, etc., those things have arisen under a government which tries to do too many things. That's the situation we have today. And what I'm saying is that if we want to address those problems, we need a different model where the state focuses on the services like education, social grants that it needs to execute to give people an opportunity in life, but then it must also get out of the way of the private sector in critical economic sectors and allow the private sector to run those sectors. Because the reality is the problems we already face is because of a state that is too interventionist and at the same time incompetent and corrupt.
Yeah.
And the way we fix that is by making the state less interventionist, less incompetent and less corrupt, by privatizing and by ending cadre deployment. It's a critical part of the story.
There seems to be some kind of a question that arises, I suppose, is because of this double speak from government. Guys saying, my question is, we as civic servants never received an increment in 2020. Was it because of COVID, right, or the COVID budget, or was it because the agreement itself was unlawful? Well, I mean, the challenge in the court says the agreement is unlawful if you look at regulations 78 and 79 of the public servants regulations. However, the reason for not paying is that we are under COVID. Is that a mere excuse?
I think it's true that the government is trying to use COVID as a way to get out of the trouble that it finds itself in. I think this extends further back, though, as I said earlier, that the economic and the fiscal crisis that we are facing, just today we've passed, our government debt is now more than 3.75 trillion rand. That's the threshold we passed earlier today. And that situation did not arise with COVID. It's something that came for at least over the past decade as the ANC continued to feed its patronage machine, employed cadres in the state, granted them massive salary increases, and now we are busy reaping the rotten fruits of that process. So I agree that it is not COVID that caused this crisis. COVID exposed this crisis.
Willie Madisha, let's look at the court ruling, particularly on this question of the unlawfulness of the enforcement of the 2018 agreement. Do you agree with what the court has ruled here, that this particular clause cannot be enforced because, one, the department doesn't have the budget to fund this from its own budget, or the funds to fund this from its own budget, and Treasury did not commit to the additional funds at the onset of the agreement?
I have followed the whole thing, both when the workers went to the negotiations in 2018 and when the agreement was reached. I followed that and even spoke to some of the trade unions to understand that which was happening. And one basically became satisfied and happy and supported the workers when the agreement was reached. So what the government was supposed to do was to implement the particular agreement so that at the end of the third year, further negotiations could be gone into so that, further or new, agreements could be reached. But then this government did not finish the whole thing. It did not implement, but simply came back and said, COVID. But then even the COVID thing, if you check, we were already owing about 4 trillion rand, all right, that we had borrowed, not we, but government, had borrowed from beyond our seas. 4 trillion that we owed, which then would force us to pay billions and billions of rands, not commission, what do you call that? Sichaba must help me. We interest. Yeah? We must pay interest in billions and billions of rents, all right? Which then says that 4 trillion on a daily basis goes up. Now, that's a major problem. Now, what government does now, it says we're having a problem, COVID and so on, it comes up, gives other, reasons, but then that does not say it has dealt with the agreement that was reached. The agreement was reached. Now, it has moved away from, the public sector workers. It has moved away the state-owned enterprises. It is just there, and no one is raising a word. What government must do is to implement the agreement. Workers are now going to negotiations, and if I was still the leader of workers, I would say let's go to the streets to make sure that this whole thing is resolved. Because the way They are working now.
Can South Africa afford a strike?
Come again?
Can South Africa afford a strike at this point?
Can afford it.
Can South Africa afford a strike? You're saying let's go to the streets.
No, the workers, if that is the last resort, that's what workers need to do. And I believe that that is the last resort, because we have here a government that does not want to listen. Therefore, there is nothing that the poor workers can do.
Member of Parliament for the Congress of the People, Willie Madisha, I appreciate your time. Dear Shadow Minister for Public Service and Administration, Schreiber, thank you very much for coming through. We'll leave with this one from Anonymous on WhatsApp, saying the current administration is taking us for a ride and has been aided by COSATU unions. These unions are silent because they were paid to sell public servants out. That's where we leave it for tonight. Thank you very much for your engagement. Next.